So I'm here with Professor Hans Mulder to discuss the million-dollar question, which is why do some digital transformations succeed and why do some fail? And Professor, first of all, thank you for joining today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Eric.
Absolutely. So before I jump into these tough questions I've got for you about transformation, success versus failure, maybe just tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, it all started with my dad, who was working for a digital equipment corporation in Boston in the 1970s, so more than 50 years ago. And then he started his own company doing implementations, and then it went wrong. So the law of Murphy came by, and we wanted to know why are we not succeeding in our digital transformations. So that led for me to a different course. I was not an expert as my dad was by having a course of 2 weeks writing code. Now I had to do high school, university, PhD to get the right level of understanding what makes a project successful.
Right.
And now I'm a professor at different universities. One of which is the University of Antwerp, where I'm lecturing about IT management, IT projects. And I'm also doing work for the courts as an expert for the courts. And then the courts expert has to say this is a good or a not so good project. And that's a hard question. That's a million-dollar question indeed, Eric. So we had to do some counseling. We went to Boston, we went to Harvard, we went to MIT, and we met the people of the Standish Group, which were doing research already then and have a database of more than 120,000 case studies on IT projects. Oh, that's interesting.
That is interesting.
That's interesting. And then we figured out that it can go right, but most likely if you don't do it right, it goes wrong. And that is the reason I'm here today, to talk with you about the research of the universities, but also about the research of the Standish Group in Boston.
Right, absolutely. And I'm also curious, in a moment, I want to ask you some questions around your expert witness experience and compare notes, because I do expert witness work, you do expert witness work. It'd be good to compare findings there. But before we jump into expert witness lawsuit-related discussions, what about your research? Your research, are there certain themes, high-level themes or summarizations of what causes a success versus a failure in a digital transformation?
Yeah, it is. So I was asked by the Dutch Parliament in 2014, and they asked me what is the top 3 of success factors or failures. And according to research, it is about people, people, and people. Only 3% is about technology.
3%.
3%.
Yeah, that's even lower than I would have thought.
That's very low. So I have seen terrible software systems implemented beautifully. I have seen beautiful IT systems implemented worse. So what we can see here is that the human factor is very much important. And from the IT perspective, that is odd, but from the perspective of the business, it is very normal. So what we have seen, and that is what we are trying to figure out now, is how to have continuous change. That's one of the research topics we have. I think that Agile is very much a solution for IT, but I think that we should have flow for the enterprise. Continuous change on a daily basis. And of course, IT is of the greatest importance.
Right, that's very interesting. And that 3% is almost shocking that it's only 3% related to the technology, because it appears, in my experience, as though an overwhelming amount of investment financially and resource-wise goes into the technology, the 3%, and not enough focus on the 97%. Is that something you've seen in your experience as well?
I've seen the same as you have, but we have seen that the most of the budget is going to meetings.
Interesting.
Meetings, so people are talking about the technology, how to make the decisions about how to implement the technology. And if you can see the budgets, I think that could be vice versa. It could be if we have less meetings, more intensive meetings, then we could reduce, I think, the overhead of the projects with more than 20–30%. So I think that if we're looking at the real cost, the hidden cost, and Standish has written about papers about it, the hidden cost, it's almost likely that we have about 30–40% of meeting time which we could very much invest elsewhere.
Now, I've heard you discuss in other sessions and hearing you speak in the past, I've heard you discuss decision latency, this concept around decision latency and how that contributes to failure or success.
That's true.
What is decision latency, and how does that affect a digital transformation?
Yeah, that was actually a finding. So when we work at the Standards Group on a case basis, and we saw that some projects had a decision issue. Namely, when you request from the project to the board for some change in the program, it took them more than 6 weeks to get an answer. And what are people doing in that 6 weeks? Waiting? Well, let's do something else.
Right.
And then the preferred answer after 6 weeks was opposite of what they expected. So they had to reverse all the decisions that were taken in the last 6 weeks, and it became worse and worse and worse. So we saw that decision latency is actually not about the quality of the decision, but the timing of the decision. And we're looking at sports, you can see the same in sports. It's about the timing. So it should be able to have a decision in a day. But how are we organized in that way? That is the difficult part of it.
Right.
So we have seen that it is a very good indicator, decision latency, especially when we relate it to 3 things, namely the organization. We talk about the good organization which is able to adapt to the change. We have the good team, which are the real working horses. They're working to make the change happen from the good team. But actually there's a third independent factor, which we call the good sponsor. And the good sponsor is not overseeing, but is inspiring, is daydreaming, is articulating the vision, is making the organization as a soul, seeing what are we going to do? What is the real necessity of this project? And we have seen that decision latency is an indicator. If the decision latency takes more than 2, 3, 4 weeks to get an answer from those 3 bodies, well, then actually the chances are very low.
Right.
So there are indicators. And it also leads me to another thing which is nice with research. If you have a database of 120,000 case studies, and you tell me I'm going to start this project, then I'm going to figure out what are your dimensions. Well, I have a team of 50 people. So I'm looking in the database. Give me all the projects of 50 people. You're working internationally. Give me all the projects which are international. I'm working in manufacturing. Okay, so there's 3,127 projects. They are lookalikes of your ideas. Do you want to know your chances? What are your odds? Well, your odds are about that you're going to fail for 44%. What should we change in our plan to increase our chances? So that is why I'm very much interested in the statistics.
Right.
Because, of course, we have lies, big lies in statistics, but the other way around, statistics are also a way to discuss those odds and see what really needs to change. And what we have seen is you don't have to change the spreadsheet. You have to improve the skills. You have to improve the skills of the good sponsor, the good skills of the team, and the skills of the organization. That are the things which works fine. So it is not that you can start from day one with a skilled team. The team has to know each other, how to work, how to behave.
Right.
And that's what we call emotional maturity. So when looking at this kind of data, we are not going to talk only about what is your business case, what is your spreadsheet. I want to know you. How do you are fitting in the project? Do you know each other's first name? No, we never worked before. Okay, that's right. But then I don't want to have results in one day. I have to wait a little bit more that you get acquainted to each other. So we have seen that that way of doing research is very valuable, but most of the time we're looking at the project results and we have to look at the skills of the people.
Interesting. So what is the overall failure rate in your 120,000 case studies that you've been tracking over the years?
Yeah.
What percentage could we expect to succeed or fail?
That's very interesting because there is no one answer. We have 3 categories. One is we call project successful. And most of the time we had the PMI definition, the Project Management Institute definition, which was on time, on budget, on target.
Right.
And what does on target mean? Well, what did we set before the start? Before we started, we said this is our target. But what does it mean if you deliver after 3-4 years? Do you still want to be on target? Because then you are delivering the things from the past.
Right.
So as a Standards Group, we were not convinced that successful is on target, on budget, and on time. We think it should be on time. I also think that it should be on budget, but it should be satisfactory. And that means we don't are measuring the start of the project, we're going to measure the adoption. And how many organizations are doing benefit tracking? Well, we have discussed it, of course, we have seen it. Only 13% of the organizations do benefit tracking. So we don't learn from the results, even successful projects, because we don't do the retrospective after a couple of years. So what we have seen is, if we're looking at the modern definition of success, it should not be measured in advance, but measured by the value you create for your customers, for your employees, and for your partners, and for the organization. Then we have a second category, which is called challenged. And most likely somebody is not happy.
Right.
And what we can see on challenged is that it is also very much depending on the size. How smaller the project, the less challenged it is. But it's very normal, because if you have a project of 3 months, the world doesn't change that much compared to 3 years.
Right.
So the less the smaller the project, the better results on challenged. And then we had the third definition, which is failed. And I also learned at university that failed is, this code is not okay. We are not delivered anything. But Standish learned, and I've seen it before, failed is not being used. And now the question you said, what are the results? If your project takes more than $10 million of labor cost, the chances of failure are 44%. Wow.
Interesting.
44%.
Wow.
And I'm lecturing my students to learn and to be very tough on their, but 44% stable.
Right.
Not just this year, but also 25 years ago, it was 44%.
That's very interesting.
It is.
with as much that has changed with cloud, AI, agile, the movement to agile,
Right.
faster implementations, the number still isn't changing despite things that sound like they should be helping projects succeed. So 44% fit into that third category of failure. What percent fall into the category of success? You had the middle one, which is the challenged, and then you had the success.
Success could be around 5 to 10%.
5 to 10%. So
That's successful. On the modern definition of satisfactory.
Okay.
If you say on target, well, it could be a little bit higher.
Right.
But it's useless.
Right. You can be on time, on budget, but not deliver business value.
Yeah.
Right. So what you're saying is it's actually the failure rate, you could argue, is actually higher in some ways than the 44%, because 44% is clearly a failure.
Right.
But then you have the challenged projects, and that seems like that would be the real, the bigger, even bigger risk than a failure.
And it is because we are measuring project cost. So we are giving a compliment to the project leader if it is within budget. But suppose the budget is 10% overrun, 10% overrun, then it will be a failure or a challenged one. Right. However, the 10% extra budget creates 100% more value.
Right.
How would you consider that?
Yeah. Right. That's a
great.
Right.
Go on.
Right. Exactly.
So it is very hard to have the definitions operationalized.
Right.
So if you're asking, is this project successful? And I'm going to call, and I'm calling the IT director. Yes, it was on target. We delivered all functionalities. And I'm going to call the finance department. Yes, it was on budget. And then I'm calling the employees, and they say, we don't work with it. What would be then the definition of this project? Would it be successful because it was on target, because it was on budget, but we don't use it? Well, we call that a failed project. So then you can see how difficult it is, because it is not that easy to establish a common ground on what is a success, what is a failure. I consider 10% more budget and delivering 100% value a success.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that is the thing how we are working with it. So it is not like we are doing surveys at the Standish Group, we are doing case study research, but a lot of them.
Right.
A lot of them.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So why do you think then the 44% has not changed in recent years?
Yes, and that is remarkable from the data. We are not stable also in our ambitions. So we have two laws. We have the law of more. Each 1.5 years we can do double of work without increasing the cost of the IT. And then we have another law, the law of Murphy. When it can go wrong, it will go wrong. So by doing more and more and more each year, having higher ambitions, we are also not improving our failure rates. So when we started doing the collection of data, it was 1994, we were looking at internal IT departments, projects, doing a, let's say, transition from one system to another. And that is difficult enough in the 1990s. But now we are looking at total transformation, not of your enterprise, but of your entire value stream. So it is not just you who are organizing and reorganizing, also your partners, also your customers. And that means that the law of more is making more, let's say, difficulties.
Interesting.
And so we are improving. That is the difficult part. We are improving. And when we see where are we improving, well, actually when we're doing no projects, that's odd. If you are changing each day by day, you don't have a failure because it's adopted.
Right.
There is no failure.
It's more organic. It's not
organic.
Right.
So we try to figure out another approach, which is not the waterfall approach or the agile approach, but a flow approach. Could we do without projects? Could we have a no project-based approach? Could we have an anti-project-based approach? Because we only want to have projects when they are the only way to transform. And you need projects. We are convinced of that. You need projects. But nowadays, everything is a project. And we have not only agile, we have even a scaled agile framework. And everything becomes a project. And I think that does not need it. We need projects, but not too many projects. And only projects which are not capable of being executed otherwise.
Right. So you also talked about executive sponsor, and the executive sponsorship is a key root cause of success versus failure.
True.
What does executive sponsorship mean to you, and in your research, what has constituted an effective executive sponsor?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. We had a master class for the Harvard Medical School, and we were asking who is the executive sponsor. Well, it was not in the room. And then we asked, how much time does the executive sponsor has to be a sponsor of the project? And we were guessing, well, that could be a couple of days perhaps per month. Well, that's a couple of hours per month. That is the time available for the executive sponsor to guide the transition, a business transition actually. And that led to the conclusion, where are the books? We do have books about good project leaders, but we don't have any books about how becoming a good sponsor. So, and I think that a good sponsor should be coached. So if you are the project leader, you should coach your executive sponsor. And that can only be done in a couple of hours. So you have to figure out, how can I communicate with my sponsor? And how can the sponsor communicate with us? And seeing where are the roadblocks on the way. How can we have another way around it, for instance? Because it is business oriented. It's not about the technology choices.
Right.
We don't want to have a super project leader. The executive sponsor actually is responsible for the business adoption, for aligning with strategy, or even adopting the strategy to the new opportunities they are creating during the project. So we have seen that that is a really interesting part, and it is the most independent variable we have. So we can see that the project team is in place, the organization is there, but we are still figuring out what is the role of the executive sponsor. And we can see beautiful examples, like how it does work and how it operationalizes. We also have done the skill set. What are the skill sets for executive sponsor? And they should be very articulated. So they should be able to communicate a kind of vision. And that has to be done not on a technical basis, like the project should be within 1 million and within 1 month. No, they should have a visionary approach, inspiring. So the Standish Group take examples from the American presidents, and they were looking at the speeches of Ronald Reagan and John F. Kennedy. And putting a man on the moon is few words, but actually the vision, the articulation is very concrete. So we think that we can learn a lot from leadership, and we should implement that in our projects by having an executive sponsor.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And I love the comparison to the man on the moon vision, because for a lot of organizations, it's like putting a man on the moon. The transformation that we are about to go through is almost like putting a man on the moon. We're going to standardize operations, we're going to enter new markets, we're going to do something big and audacious and difficult and risky. And so I think it's an underrated part of digital transformation is that executive sponsorship piece of it. So how do you reconcile the fact that most executives appear to only have a couple of hours per month to focus on being a good executive sponsor? How do we reconcile what's needed in the role and the reality of their capacity and abilities?
Right. We have a kind of scale, and we don't want to have a mother hen which is always there, because that will bother the project leaders. Mm-hmm. We also don't want to have to be somebody who's absent. So how to be visible, how to be in place, is to be communicative. So I think that it starts with taking your platform, taking your moments where the executive sponsor is able to organize the shared vision. And it all starts, I think, with listening. So the good sponsor is not somebody who says, this is how it should be done. They ask you, Eric, how do you think it should be done? Okay, thank you. How do you think it should be done? Let me continue, and then you can see that we are all on the same page. So the most important thing, I think, of the executive sponsor is to build consensus and to make sharp decisions. And now we come back to, again, decision latency.
Right.
It is not the duration which is stating, okay, this is a good decision. It is the timing of the decision. So the good sponsor shouldn't be there for many days, a month, but should be on the right time, on the right moment, talking to the right people. And that, I think, is very important, that you have the relations between people and connecting the dots. And we have seen where it works, because most likely the one who doesn't want to become executive sponsor is the best sponsor.
Right, right.
Knows the people, has a heart for the business, and we call that expert leadership. There's a real good PhD on that part, expert leadership. And take a comparison from the Formula One races. There are three kinds of leaders. The one who is business leader because responsible for the finance of the Formula One team. Or we have the mechanics for, let's say, how to construct the car. And we have teams who are led by the driver. Who do you think are the most successful Formula One teams?
That's a good question. I would think the driver, but is that
spot on?
Okay.
Spot on. So why do we think when we're having an IT digital transition that we should have somebody who doesn't have the driving experience of doing the business? So we need to have people who are accepted, but also have an expert, deep insight in the operations of the business. And that expert leadership, I think, should be expressed in a role which we call the good sponsor. So they don't need to do it for days, but they need to make the right phone calls.
Right, right. Yeah, and involve the right people.
Right people.
And ultimately, to your point about decision latency, they have to be willing to make the decision quickly. If you and I, for example, you and I don't agree, we provide conflicting input to our leader on what we think the future should be. That leader has to ultimately decide, I'm not going to make both Professor and Eric happy, so I need to make the decision, and we need to move forward. And if I don't agree with you, and I don't agree, it was my idea that's being taken into consideration, it's still, the leader has to ensure that I get on board and that we're all aligned, even if we don't agree.
So you can see that it is also about the decision acceptance. And that has to do with authority, which is not a position, but is something which is given to you. And you are a leader because you have followers. So people have to follow the project sponsor because they have trust in the sponsor. And the sponsor, well, actually doesn't like to be a sponsor, but has to, because the value for the organization is the most important value you can have. So the sponsor has somebody who is really listening, very attentive, but also very fast and swift. And then you can see beautiful things happen.
Right.
Projects which are not on time, but before time.
Right, right.
Overvalue, creating more value than we expected.
Yeah.
And then I think then the energy grows, and you can feel it. And people really like to do that. People like to work. People like to do those good things. So therefore we talk about good sponsor, good team, and a good place. And I think that we should improve the skill sets of the good sponsor.
Right.
That is really helping a lot.
Right. So you also mentioned that you're an expert witness, and that's a common trait that you and I have. We both testify in courts and analyze failures. Do you have an example, without necessarily mentioning names, do you have an example of a massive failure that's maybe the biggest you've ever seen, or the most full of lessons? Do you have one in particular that sort of stands out as a good case study?
Yeah, I have case studies. Some are my own expert reports, but the best thing yet I've seen was the project in Australia, which started as a small project and ended up with more than 1.3 billion Australian dollars and not working.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. So that was for me very, let's say, comfortable that it is not a European problem. It is a universal problem. And as you just mentioned, you're also doing court cases. So I also mentioned that also in the US it will be a problem. So actually it is a universal problem. And there are a couple of reasons why I think it's so hard to do the projects. And it is again about the human factor, but also about overestimating your own competences and underestimating the complexities of what we are doing. And if we have a more realistic approach, then we see the chances going the right way. So for me, it's always about the blue skies in the beginning. People are saying, well, the technology will help us and we can do it. And at the end, it will lead to a court case. And I think that is because of the emotional maturity is not that well developed. The emotional maturity should be, we are doing a project because there is no other way to do the change. If we could do it in our daily work, we shouldn't have a project. So we should consider a project per definition as something which is risky. And because it is risky, I don't want to have big risks. So I want to have small risks. So I want to diminish my risk in advance. So I can see that most likely that the projects who are in court cases are perhaps because they have a bad sponsor. And the bad sponsor says, whatever the cost. No, whatever the cost, it will cost you a lot.
Right.
And most likely that will be by the big firms, but also about government, because they have big budgets. So I think that there's a correlation between your emotional maturity, knowing that projects are risky and that you have to do it on a well-defined basis, also knowing that you cannot anticipate to the future, so you should be flexible enough to change your approach. And if that's done, then there is no court case because you can resolve it yourself. If people are really fixed, then there's no way out. The other way out is going to the courts. And that is, of course, a very harmful decision.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that's very interesting. A lot of good lessons from not only a $1 billion failure, but also just all the general lessons from your years and years of research. So thank you for being here today, and thanks for taking the time to chat about this exciting topic.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Appreciate it.